So I have a three-part introduction today. I'm going to read Dr. Kane's, sort of formal introduction. That'll be one. Then I'm going to talk about how I know him and what motivated, in part, wanting him to come here and share his perspective and his story. And then I'll end with a brief, very brief anecdote of a conversation I had with a junior faculty member this week that really highlights just how timely this talk is. So part one, Dr. Keynes is a neuropsychiatrist with a career in basic science, clinical psychiatry, and neuroscience drug discovery spanning more than 30 years. We were fellows together, so I know that part's true. Prior to joining Ancora, where he is currently as CEO, he was most recently the chief medical officer at Sage Therapeutics, where he led the successful clinical development of Zulresso, which was the first ever treatment approved for postpartum depression, alongside building out the developmental organization and Sage Therapeutics' broad neuroscience portfolio. Before that, Dr. Keynes was the executive director in clinical development in the inflammation, neuroscience, and respiratory therapeutics area for AstraZeneca. And prior to that, he was a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania in the Department of Psychiatry, which is where we worked together for, I think, about 5 years.
Yep.
So, second part, I'm just going to talk a little bit, sort of personally about Steve and his transition to industry, and then the brief anecdote. So we were, I think, briefly fellows together in neuropsychiatry, and Steve moved to the faculty just before I did, about a year earlier. And, this was a very, I think, it was sort of a wonderful time and a wonderful place. And, he had a basic science lab, seeing clinical patients in this environment. And I'd say about 5 years in, and Steve, I'm going to ask you at the end of this to sort of tell your story, but at the end of this, decided that this wasn't the environment for him. This wasn't the environment that was really capturing his best skills, and made, at the time, I think, a much less standard, a bolder move, and moved over to industry really early in his career, about 5 years in. And as friends and colleagues, I watched as, I would say without hyperbole, within a year, he became his boss's boss. So made this sort of really sort of meteoric rise through the ranks at AstraZeneca, a really large pharmaceutical company where his unique talents really gelled. The things that he was good at really were important there. And then has moved up, as I read in his bio, successively through different companies, taking on larger and larger roles, and now is at this biopharmaceutical company, sort of really at the leading edge of new technologies as CEO. So now the brief anecdote. Speaking with a junior faculty member earlier this week, she shared that she felt like there's a culture in academia that paints a unitary path where success looks like rising through the ranks in academia, and leaving that path looks like failure. And she was bemoaning how inconsistent that felt to her, that she felt like there were many paths to success, only one of which was academia, and that she kind of refused to buy into this overarching ethos that you have to thrive this way. I was surprised to hear it. That felt like the narrative when I was in her shoes 30 years ago. And it was a little disheartening to hear that anybody still felt that way. So Steve Keynes is here today to tell us otherwise. He's going to talk largely about collaborations with industry and what they look for and what a good collaboration looks like, but also, as he was just saying as we all entered, He's happy to share his narrative, his journey, and what success has looked like for him, because it has looked pretty good. So, Steve, without any more rambling and babbling, on to you, and thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, well, thanks, Steve, for that warm introduction. Of course, I'm going to say something that people in my position often say, which is listening to that story makes me feel old, but that's okay because I have had a chance to do a lot of different things in my life. In fact, Steve and I go back, you didn't mention this, all the way back to when we were MD PhD students, and there was a network of MD PhD students in the New York area. And Steve was part of that. I was part of that as well. And so we even had, informal interactions way back then when it seemed that the only path was to finish your program, already a long haul, do a residency, do a fellowship, get a faculty position. And from my perspective, I had been doing psychiatry research even as an undergraduate at Penn. So my first sort of vision of what it means to have a career in research was literally working in the same department that Steve and I were both in. And that was the plan all along. I was going to go train. I was going to come back to Philadelphia. I was going to work in neuropsychiatry, have a basic science lab, get grants, get nice lab space, and grow from there. And the fact of the matter is, I did those things. And as Steve said, and this was not an easy decision, it was not satisfying. Now it's very hard. You guys are all in your professions and you know exactly what I'm saying. You go into your field with a vision of what it's going to be like for you, and you have to make decisions when you're much younger about how you're going to imagine it will be when you get there. And that's particularly true in these long haul careers in academia. But what do you do if that's not really for you? And I'll give you a few personal examples. I hated, and Steve knows this for a fact, writing papers. You know what? That's a dead end. That is an absolute dead end in academia. You guys all know that. And for me, writing the grants and writing the papers was literally like pulling teeth. Love doing the science, love discovering new things, like doing things that were useful. Hated sitting down. This probably goes back to my childhood. I was never verbally fluent on the page. Speaking, not a problem. And it really became a barrier to moving forward professionally. I hated it. And each day felt like a burden. And so the question is, what do you do? Clinical, go back to, sort of straight up clinical treatment of patients, perfectly viable option. But maybe there is some way, and Steve had a great lead in, to use all of the things that I had learned both as a basic scientist, not so much a clinical research, I hadn't done clinical research before, but is there a way to take things that I had learned and apply them in a different way? And fortunately, I had great mentorship. This was both at Penn, but perhaps most impactfully at Yale, where I did my residency. And the name of the person, I'll just name him because he was such an influential person, is George Henninger, who at the time was running the Neuroscience Research Center at Connecticut Mental Health Center. And what he had said to many of us was, look, I can teach you all how to do clinical medicine and prescribe antidepressants and antipsychotics, but if any of you have an idea that you want to come up with new treatments for patients, whether that be in basic science or clinical research, you should probably do that, because in one stroke, you can affect many, many more patients' lives. And that was a statement that he would make every once in a while, but really sort of stuck with me and many of my colleagues. And I'll share some of those stories as we go through this. I will just say, and we can do this during Q&A, even with that, it was not an easy decision to leave academia. My family thought I was nuts. My parents thought I had given it up. My grandmother cried. And my colleagues, as Steve said, really wondered what it was that I was looking for by leaving. And, the pharmaceutical industry in particular didn't at the time, and probably still doesn't have the greatest reputation in terms of integrity and so forth. And we can get into some of that as well. But nonetheless, made the choice and haven't looked back. And there's a lot of things you can do there that are different and complementary to the kinds of things that you can do within an academic setting. And part of the story I want to tell is that the work itself is not so diametrically opposed as one might imagine. So over the course of the next hour plus, I want to talk a little bit about what academic industry collaborations look like when they're done well. I'll talk a little bit about, and this is entirely biased. This is, Steve Kane's view of the world of what this looks like. I'll stop for Q&A, so please put questions in the chat. I was imagining when I agreed to do this that we'd be sitting around a table in real life. So apologies for that, but please ask questions. I'll answer anything you ask, and including what Ancora does or doesn't do, startup company, Series A, blah, blah, blah. How you make connections if you're interested in exploring what an academic or industry collaboration is, or even, what kinds of roles there are in industry and which ones are good and which ones are not good. And there are insights and to share across those things as well. So let me just plunge into it, and then happy to see where this discussion leads. So this are the topics for today. They're kind of the structure in which I'll hang all these stories around, but it's to sort of clear the air a little bit. I'm imagining many of you earlier in your careers in academia, and there's a lot of language that's used in collaborations industry that aren't necessarily as clear as they might be. So what I thought I'd do is specifically talk about individual investigator relationships with industry. There's a lot of other areas where academic sort of endeavors interact with industry, whether it be an inventor who looks for venture capital to start a company, and you're in California. That's not in scope for today. It's a different talk. I'd be happy to come back and talk to that. That's very different. The other is one that would probably be geared towards Steve and his colleagues, which is sort of larger institutional partnerships with industry, where a company or a consortium of companies would sort of engage with a academic center for discovery and basic science. But this is more meant to talk about what are the opportunities early on that people can use for engaging, whether it be for participation in large-scale clinical trials, investigator-initiated trials, sponsored research. A lot of times people use these kinds of things as seed money for initial grants and so forth, which are also really important parts of the research endeavor. And also touching on some of the other things and somebody had mentioned, data ownership, which leads into probably one of the stickiest wickets regarding all of this, which is intellectual property and how to best manage that. So these are some of the topics. If there are others that I'm not touching on here, because these are the ones that were most important to me, please throw them in the chat. But we'll talk first about industry-sponsored clinical trials. We'll spend a lot of time in investigator-initiated research, which is an area that everyone, if you're physicians, you should all know about, and how they work. They're close cousins, sponsored research agreements and research grants. And then talk about the language around advisory boards, clinical and scientific advisory boards, and then sharing my observations on what represents best practices there, which are no different from any other business or professional personal relationship. So industry-sponsored clinical trials, this is what people think of most when they think about people like me in industry. I'm the CEO of a biotech company. Before this, as a chief medical officer at a biotech company. And before that, as Steve said, I was at AstraZeneca doing translational science and clinical research of all types. If you had run the clock back 20 years and told me that this is what I'd be talking to you about 20 years later, I would have thought you were absolutely nuts. I hadn't even done a clinical trial in my life before going into industry. I was a basic scientist and behavioral pharmacologist with some level of genetics and so forth, looking at brain structures and the factory bulb and doing behavioral genetics and some level of pharmacology. Did not touch clinical research at all. Didn't think it was science. really hadn't been trained in it, had no prior experience, just to put that out there. Needless to say, I've learned a lot since then. I have different views, but in any case, industry-sponsored clinical trials is what people outside of the industry think that people like me do. So this is phase 1 through everything beyond that. Translational science fits into this as well. And let's just unpack this a little bit. Industry sponsored, in this case, doesn't just mean industry paid for, but it also has a technical meaning, which is regulatory sponsorship. And I'll hit on that point a number of times. It means that the company owns the responsibility around everything from data integrity to understanding signaling for patient safety, to the conduct of the trial, to being accountable for all of the quality of the drugs that are being delivered, as well as the sort of transparent reporting of those outcomes. It is a high level of responsibility. It has to do with pretty much all the things that are invisible to people not inside of the industry, all revolve around what it means to be a sponsor. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg, which is like the data and the results in the papers, represents probably the smallest fraction of what happens inside of a pharmaceutical company around the clinical research. It's the infrastructure pieces that are, if you like this sort of thing, take up a lot of our time and energy, as appropriately so. So company is a regulatory sponsor and, of course, the owner of the data. And typically these are part of a registration program or an aspirational registration program for a new drug. Often these are multi-site trials. If it's a phase 2 or a phase 3 study, so phase 2 meaning up to proof of concept, phase 3, the sort of the heavy duty registration programs, typically they're, depending upon the therapeutic area, they're taking place at multiple investigational sites in the United States and around the world. And the first thing I should point out is that sometimes the language here can get a little confusing. So when you're dealing with a multi-site sponsored clinical trial, you at USC would be named as a principal investigator. The site level principal investigator is not the same as the principal investigator, who would typically be an overall academic principal investigator who is contracted separately from the trial, and who is the sort of the overall responsible or external person related to that study. And this is often a point of real confusion, particularly for people who haven't done this before, because it speaks to things like data ownership and how and what you ought to be able to do and what you should be able to do for those trials. For the larger ones, if you're in oncology or respiratory, and sometimes in psychiatry, which is my field in neurology, there'll be a steering committee that is kind of the most senior academic folks who are involved that advise the company around the trial. And what your rights are as an investigator are really defined by how you set up those expectations up front, and we'll talk a lot about that. Importantly, for industry-sponsored clinical trials, there's essentially no flexibility in the trial conduct at all. What it says in the protocol is what you do, take it or leave it. And it's typically a combination included in the study of academic research institutions, USC, you name it, as well as professional contract research organizations. These are freestanding research organizations that only do clinical trials, or sometimes they're part of physicians' offices. This is the sort of the bread and butter of drug development, but it leaves out enormous chunks of what it is that happen at the boundaries between industry and academia. So I'll take a pause there and see if there are any questions about this, because this is probably the first entry point that people have into participation with industry. All right, seeing none, I will go on. The one thing I would say on this point, and let me see if I have it on my next slide. Yeah, this is probably I'll give you the industry view on all of this, which is that there are good academic centers and there are not as good academic centers. There's no bad academic centers. I can't say I'm very bad. But the ones that are really interested in doing this as part of their mission get a lot of work in these areas. And sometimes there are faculty members who are really adept at doing these kinds of trials, and ultimately through their career end up being, really sought out as masters of how best to both design as well as implement clinical trials. In psychiatry, MGH is well regarded in this, for these kinds of studies. In other areas for pulmonary, Duke is, I think there are places where people really make this a priority. But it doesn't mean that any institution there's any real advantage or elsewhere. And Steve, I remember many years ago talking to you about this. One of the things that really make an academic center desirable for a biotech or a pharmaceutical company to work with includes some of these characteristics. So speed, efficiency, and the clear capability and the interest of the principal investigator are absolutely key. If there's somebody who is interested in doing this work and they identify themselves and are going to sort of shepherd all of the bureaucracy through their institution, that really, really matters. It matters to the sponsor, which is a drug company, and it matters to the people that we're working with. Well-oiled internal research machinery. Now, if you've done research, understand that if the IRB takes for bloody ever, or the contracting office holds you up, studies can start and end before the trial, before you've even had a chance to participate, and that's really unfortunate. Having a good clinical research staff, specialized capability, of course, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. And particularly if there are individuals who are looking to position themselves as up-and-coming leaders, not only recognized experts. These are all really desirable qualities. Steve, I see you have your hand up, so why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. So thanks for pointing that out. Those are all sort of institutional things. And
Yep.
It does make me remember how, I've heard over the years, we have our perceptions, people in academia have perceptions of industry, and the industry perceives us as slow, inefficient, so it's a kind of speed versus, more of a long-term vision. The other thing that I felt like I ran up against when I started working with industry was a recognition that at the time, right, so this was a long time ago, the quality standards in industry were like 2 orders of magnitude higher, right? Yep. So the attention to detail, the following of protocols, the extent to which documentation and sort of everything was just a couple of levels up, and the average academic had no idea that the work they were doing just wouldn't cut it. Has that evolved over the years?
The short answer is no. And it comes down to what I was saying first, which is when I say speed, efficiency, and clear capability and interest of the PI, from the sponsor's perspective, if the PI understands, the principal investigator, the site level principal investigator understands all of those things that you just listed, Steve, the rest is smooth sailing, because that's really where this comes from. So, there was a time, and this goes back to when I got into this business, that clinical trials were viewed as a bit of a cash cow. You can do them. They weren't very hard. It's cookie cutter. You hire a research assistant. The patients come in, they get treated, they get your blood pressure. Somebody ticks off a bunch of boxes, and everything goes on its way. That is changed because there's so much more. I would say, the attention of companies is moving more towards individuals and institutions that take this really seriously. And again, that is a great, like, if, for example, if somebody is interested in doing this, understanding what it takes to do this, both at an institutional level as well as an individual level, goes a really, really long way. So, and I'll get into this a little bit later, which is how it goes determines how it goes in the future, if this is something that you're interested in adding to your portfolio of academic activities. So yeah, I mean, but the institution matters. The institution does matter, because you could have the best investigator in the world, or the most with specialized capability. And so, for example, if you are a world-renowned expert in brain imaging or cardiovascular interventions or whatever your field is, And, it's very clear that your trajectory as an academic and your reputation is very, very high and you're sought out. If the institution you're working in, and I don't think this is true at USC, but it could, you could end up in a place that needs to develop the skill further. If that gets in the way, that will limit your ability to actually participate, at least in multi-center clinical trials, because it's not just about speed, but it's about cutting through bureaucracy and things that would otherwise be barriers to actually getting to the work. Not speed for speed's sake. I mean, sometimes this is trivialized in that way, but it really is, which things are value adding. Now, I can tell you the place where some of these, where some of the things come up, and we'll touch on that. But for companies like mine, so I'll just share with you what Ancora is. Ancora is a startup company. Ancora has one employee. That is me. And we work entirely with external everybody. And so, and when Sage, when I joined, was in a very similar state. The execution of initial clinical trials is existential. There is no tolerance. There's no ability actually for small companies to really sort of take it easy around internal delays and bureaucracy. So I'll give you an example. There's an institution, very world-renowned, it's an East Coast institution, and they're sought out for their expertise. However, to actually work with individual investigators, not only does a protocol have to pass the IRB before the contracting group looks at it, it also needs to pass the nursing group, the pharmacy research committee, then it goes through a preliminary view of the IRB, and then finally it goes through an IRB before going back to being recontracted. That process can take between 7 and 9 months. Typically, large-scale clinical trials, if not over, will be more than half over. And as an investigator, you're wondering whether or not there's really enough time for you to even have an opportunity to enroll a patient. Those kinds of things are enormous disincentives, and larger institutions that have come into those, and our former institution was one of them, and has changed it dramatically. And I won't name names, but the internal workings of institutions can really be either a huge wind at your sails or an impediment as it represents your ability to interact with industry, not just for industry sponsored trials. I mean, there's going to be a limited number of people who are interested in these, although they're really fun and really exciting because if they're positive, you're participating in something that's really exceptional. And I'll share some examples of those. So, it's a bit about, how interested are you in doing this kind of work? I'll put a plug in it. There is nothing in the world, if you're interested in coming up with new medicines, then, living one day when there wasn't a treatment for disease X, and the next day there was such a treatment, and that you were directly part of that. It's unlike anything I've personally experienced professionally. Next, we're talking about investigator-sponsored research. This is another area that's a really interesting one for faculty members. So let me spend a few minutes describing this. These have the look and feel, maybe this is of multi-center trials, but they're very, very different from the company's perspective. And they have many names. This is one of the problems about this, is that different companies use different nomenclature. So investigator-sponsored research are also known as investigator-initiated trials, or investigator-sponsored trials, or investigator-initiated research. It's a bit of a morass. There are many names for the same thing. And what this is you're, researcher or faculty member, and you have a really good idea about what to explore for either a drug that's late in its development or potentially even launched. But you don't have seed money, and you're not going to get it from the NIH to see whether or not drug X works in disease Y. And it's a really interesting scientific idea. It could potentially be really important for medicine as well. So there is a mechanism, and it exists essentially in all biotech and pharmaceutical companies, and large pharmaceutical companies in particular are really adept at this, to have academic investigators specifically propose research grants to those institutions. Now, this is an area that historically has been quite fraught, and I can speak to that. But it's a great way to both do research, to be supported, even potentially to get preliminary data prior to larger scale clinical trials that are funded either by investigator, the NIH, or foundations and so forth. But it comes at a price, and the price is an enormous amount of organizational responsibility. So remember when I said we had an industry-sponsored trials, investigator-sponsored trials are the exact opposite. In this case, the investigator is both the investigator, principal investigator, and sponsor. And that means all the stuff that a pharmaceutical company might otherwise be doing, including being accountable for good clinical practice. And if you're not familiar with that, I won't go into, chapter and verse on this, but these are sort of the federal regulations that govern the conduct of clinical trials that a pharmaceutical company needs to adhere to. And typically at an institution like yours, you would have a research office that is able to sort of help you with this. But as a principal investigator, you then sign on to be accountable for all aspects of study conduct, everything, including drug handling, return of unused drugs, every bit of data, its record keeping for an appropriate period of time, reporting of serious adverse events to the FDA within appropriate time periods, annual maintenance of the IND, FDA audits, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a ton of stuff that happens in the back office that you become accountable for this. So these are the kind of studies that are done typically, if you're at a larger institution in a medical school, there is an infrastructure to actually facilitate this. If you're not familiar with it, and this is an area that you're interested in, get familiar with it. Typically, if you're in oncology or other fields, many of the protocols that you're running are in the investigator-initiated realm, so it's more familiar. In areas of neurology and psychiatry, it's perhaps less so. But it's something that requires a very high level of sophistication to do well. Of course, you do end up with a much higher level of ownership of the data. And again, I will open that up for discussion later on, because as the principal investigator, sponsor, and sole, and sole sort of, inventor of the protocol, you have a much higher level of ownership of that outcome. And that's an important piece of this as well. And this is why we do it. This is why companies do it. Might identify potential new pathways for drugs and labels, a deeper understanding for the mechanisms of action that may very well, spring to, breakthroughs in the field. A lot of times these are benefit risk, or maybe even open label studies to get real world evidence. Pharmacoeconomic studies are in this realm. We can understand more about the drug and its supply, whether or not it's sort of leaking into other usage. And the support that companies can give is all over the map. And we can pretty much support all the pieces that your institution doesn't provide. The key to this is to have those discussions up front, so you know what you're getting into. It doesn't necessarily need to be just dollars or just drugs. There's a lot of know-how on how to keep these things going and to do them well, that your colleagues and collaborators can support with. But of course, there is going to be things that you're going to own: safety, regulatory compliance, disclosure responsibilities, and so forth. The other thing that you should know about this is these are typically not run through the R&D organization of a company. They're run through medical affairs. These are sort of the frontline people. And, when we get into discussions of what are the kind of roles that physicians play inside of companies, there's typically R&D roles, there's medical affairs roles, and then there's executive roles. Medical affairs is sort of an interface, scientifically based organization that's not directly involved in sales, but are typically the people that you'd see presenting at meetings or manning booths and so forth. And the application procedure is relatively straightforward. You write a relatively brief application, either you submit it in writing or through a web portal. Many companies have an external review where they sort of prioritize the scientific merit, in alignment with the company's strategic priorities. But most importantly, the ideas have to come from you. Now, historically, this has been an area where there's been a lot of abuse. I won't kid you, where a company would come and say to prominent investigator X, hey, it would be great if you did a study with our drug, and here's a couple $100,000 to do that very brief study. And I hope that at some point you publish a paper that shows positive data. And that was probably about 15, 20 years ago. That was an area rife with abuse, quite frankly. And it's one of the things that gave our industry, number one, and this mechanism a bad name. I can assure you that there are many ways to do this in a compliant manner. Historically, this is how a lot of real innovation has happened, both in translational science, as well as, within industry and academic industry collaborations as well. And there's much higher attentiveness, particularly on the university side, but even at the pharmaceutical company side, to ensure that people feel both safe, protected, and compliant. And those things absolutely are, those are absolutes. A hint from me is if a person who has a sales force suggests that you should do an investigator-sponsored trial, walk the other way, talk to your compliance officer, and don't engage. That is a path that is rife with trouble for all of you, and it shouldn't happen, but it would also result in all sorts of trouble, both for the company as well as for the investigators. And there are many other ways to do this. One of the reasons why I'm here is that there are absolutely proper and above board ways to do this, and it involves you as investigators actually approaching the company and saying, I have a really good idea. Of course, the other part of that is that it also protects you from an IP and publication perspective, because there's no question about where the ideas originated. And these are really important things as you think about injecting new ideas into a large organization that would otherwise be extraordinarily protective both of its intellectual property as well as the drugs that are so important to the companies. There's a great guidance. I have the websites later on that I'll show you. There's a few bits of resource. Probably the most useful bit of information in this regard is a guidance from the FDA called the Investigational New Drug Applications Prepared and Submitted by sponsor investigators. It's a very quick read. It tells you everything you really need to do from the FDA's perspective on how to actually do this well. Your research office, I'm sure, knows this backwards and forwards. But it's something that if this is an area that you're interested in, you should definitely get familiar with, because it gives you a good idea of how all the pieces go. I think that's all I have to say. This is a really important area. It's where a lot of people get tripped up because they confuse trial number one with trial number two. And investigator-sponsored trials really are a place where you have a lot of latitude to get creative, and if it's something that captures the attention of a company, can be an extraordinarily productive area of research. I'm going to just take a pause there and see if there's any questions about this, because this is one that I really encourage people to sort of understand more about.
Are you saying that the intellectual property is that by contacting them and doing that in writing, that the intellectual property definitely then belongs to you, the investigator, or is there more to it than that?
Well, so it's a great question, and the answer is it depends. And when I say it depends on what the company has already protected, right? So you as an investigator won't know pretty much everything that's already been filed on a drug in a therapeutic area. And so you don't know whether or not there's a priority of, let's just use patents as an example. You don't know if the company has already filed a patent on that idea. What you wouldn't want to do is make the assumption that they have done that, and you inject the idea, and then somehow there's a question about whether or not you had primacy. And so by using this process, if it hadn't been claimed already, you would then you'd be named as, you'd have to be named as an inventor. So it protects you without you knowing whether or not you actually have that right, if that makes sense. So for example, if there's something that a company hasn't protected, and companies, mine included, I'm only myself, we have like an army of lawyers that are trying to protect everything they can. You can't really get patents on everything. But companies will try to do this in order to protect their own interests. However, you may come up with an idea that's both important but hadn't been contemplated before. You certainly would want to be able to both protect yourself, and this is where your technology transfer office and your legal counsel and so forth will be able to help you, but you'd want to be able to sort of submit that directly, and with dates and times and stamps, and not have prior discussions before those go through. So this is more, it has that opportunity without contaminating those interactions. Steve, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that if you're going to go to a company with a novel idea, something that's not protected,
Yep.
it would make a lot of sense to first talk with the technology transfer office here.
Yep. So yes, and by the way, I'm the CEO of a company. I am a ravenous capitalist. I won't even show these slides to you guys without reviewing them legally. So if you have good ideas, Steve's advice is absolutely solid gold. Doesn't mean that you get a patent, but it means that you have the ability to protect your interests. Now, the other piece of it, which is also important, is the other coin of the realm. It's not just dollars and patents and so forth, because those will be owned by your university in any case, or with some interest, I'm sure. But it also protects your right to publish, regardless of the outcome, right? So in a multi-center trial, I didn't get into this. The multi-center trial, typically there's a part of that research agreement which says that you have a right to publish the data that you've collected at your own site, but you can't do that until after the primary results of the broader, large-scale clinical trial have been published. That's a standard agreement. And so there's an obligation of the company to publish the data, right or wrong, and publish, by publish, I mean, not necessarily in a journal, but disclose the data either at a conference, clinicaltrials.gov, and so forth. After that has happened, you have the right to do whatever you want with the data that was collected at your institution. So those are typically the places that are negotiated up front for the clinical trial agreements, which are these large agreements around multi-site trials. In an investigator-sponsored trial, it's very different, which is the ownership of the data typically rests with the institution around publication. But that's something that you want to agree around upfront and make sure that it actually does what you expect it to do. Otherwise, it wouldn't necessarily be worth your while to go ahead and do it, unless the need for things like seed grant money and so forth were more important than publication, as an example. Does that make sense? But yeah, it's definitely different, rights. And the other thing is, an investigator-sponsored trial doesn't have to be a single site. You can, as an investigator, put together a consortium. So, many times, just like an NIH grant, 3 or 4, colleagues at different institutions would apply together, for an investigator-sponsored trial, looking for support for either monetary support for hiring a research assistant, potentially support in kind with supply of drug, and some other technical assistance. Now, the other things to keep in mind is all of those things are disclosable for a drug that's approved. So whether or not you get a specific dollar remuneration for your efforts, due to Sunshine Act reporting, all of those contributions in kind are reported as dollars that go to you as investigators. Nothing to be ashamed of, but something to be aware of. So, for example, if you were looking to do a trial with brexanolone, say, which is Zulresso at Sage, the retail price for each of those doses would be reportable as a contribution. And so if you have university, contribution limits based on how much you're able to get from industry sponsorship, those would count towards those. And that's just an important thing to keep in mind. It's not a reason not to do it, just to sort of understand that everything from medical writing to any support in kind is disclosable. But that's just kind of the rules of the road. Sponsor research agreements. This is another area. So for those of you who run basic science labs, this is yet one sort of level less restrictive, and it's another way that people can get research funding and collaborate with institutions directly. It's like an investigator-sponsored trial, but it's typically in either earlier phases of research, so pharmacology or behavioral pharmacology, in vitro or in vivo, genetics or genomics. So, for example, if you have genetic samples that you're interested in seeing whether or not there's some sort of biomarker related to disease of interest, imaging often falls into this area as well. These are areas that don't have the same kind of sensitivities at companies, meaning if a company is going to be contributing or support about an approved drug, there's going to be an enormous amount of oversight to ensure that you have the capability to do the work well. There's no expectation that you won't do these kinds of work well, but it doesn't rise to the same level of risk to the company, meaning that you're not necessarily putting a drug that's in people at risk. So typically what happens here for, say, pharmacology, if you're running a basic science lab, is companies will take a close cousin of their drug in development or one that's approved, and make it available in a sort of in a free intellectual collaboration space, which will allow you to understand and explore the mechanism of action without necessarily putting a live drug, meaning one that's in use, at risk. And so that's a really great way to get going. There are many examples of this in almost all fields. Any company that's really interested in collaborating in a good way will sort of assign drugs related to their main compound that will allow free publication, a lot of sort of much more direct intellectual discourse. And epidemiology falls into this, pharmacoeconomics research falls into this, and so forth. The good part about these kinds of grants is there's much less compliance sensitivity around this as well, because we're not talking about the potential appearance of conflict. So these aren't drugs that are being used. They're not, perceived as quid pro quo. They're much more exploratory. And so companies can typically freely interact with investigators around the design and execution of these. And, getting back to the data question, you have to negotiate up front how you're going to handle ownership of the data and how the best can be used. And those can sometimes be delicate discussions, but I've never seen one not land to mutual satisfaction. But again, allows for much more collaboration. For an investigator-sponsored trial, you can do warmer, hotter, cold, but we really, as a company, can't really give you specific advice on how to go about it, nor would you really want that advice. There's no formal process typically. The most common ways in which these things come up are people meet at conferences, say, I had a really interesting idea. Is there any way that I can get a hold of your new drug that you just got approved to do a study in my cell cultures? And the person you're talking to would say, absolutely not, but you should talk to our head of research because they have a drug just like it that we use specifically for these kinds of requests, and here's their email. And then just figure out whether it makes sense to do and whether there's any dollars to do that. Large companies do this a lot. Small companies also do it quite a bit because it extends their capability. So some of the most productive research collaborations I've had when both now at Ancora and previously at Sage have been in this area as well. Just a few other words about other things that you've probably heard about if you hadn't had a chance to participate in as well. There's clinical and scientific advisory boards and advisory boards, ad boards. They sound alike. They're really, 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 really different. An advisory board or ad board, it's a generic term used in biotech and biopharma. It's any group of experts in the field that are assembled to give advice, typically around a very specific topic. If you've had an opportunity to do this, it can be really fun. It's almost like a, what do they call it as in advertising? You sort of talk to people, a focus group where strategic questions are asked. You can sort of say, no, that's a good idea. It's a bad idea. I don't like it. But everybody from the commercial people will say, do you like these ads, or are they offensive, to this is the therapeutic area that we're interested in getting into. All of those can be kind of ad boards, advisory boards. They're usually very short. Maximum could be half a day now on Zoom, or 1 to 2 days maximum, and then come from any part of the pharma world. That's an ad board or advisory board. There's a separate thing, which is, from my perspective, inherently more interesting. You didn't hear me say that, don't quote me. And these are clinical and scientific advisory boards. These are sort of standing committees, almost like boards of directors, that advise companies on how to go about their work. And typically they're assembled by people who are perceived as leaders or up and coming leaders in their field. And they're often sort of put together early on. They'll meet quarterly to review and give advice on either scientific advances or the developing programs. And it operates much more like a board of directors, with some direct level of oversight of the programs, accountable both to the executive team as well as the board of directors of the company in terms of their advice, and whether it is or isn't being followed by the R&D teams. Those are two very different things. They sound alike. They're easily confused. You'll often, if you go to like a small company, you'll see the clinical advisory board, the scientific advisory board named. That's usually a bit of a tactical maneuver to sort of raise interest and say we're a credible company because we're getting our advice from the best people in the field. So just a few words of best practices before we get into any additional discussion in any sort of areas. The things that I've seen that actually make all of this work is discuss up front the goals of both partners. And I mean, really get honest with yourself and with whoever you're talking to about what you're looking to accomplish. If your interest is in getting seed funding to get your lab started, just be honest about that. I've got a good idea. This is in my therapeutic area. The most important thing to me is that I can hire research tech. I can get some, preliminary data, maybe a publication, and get the ball rolling. Perfectly fine goal. Be explicit. Be explicit. Likewise, companies don't do this. They're not like the NIH. This is not out of beneficence. They're often looking to accomplish a specific goal, an exploratory study in an area that they haven't gotten a chance to do because it's either too expensive or outside of their expertise area. The need to sort of understand more in terms of mechanism. There's always something that companies are looking to achieve through these, and it's important for you to understand what those goals are. And transparency of communication is absolutely clear. Know who you're talking to, and know who, if you have a problem with the way things are going, you can actually raise those issues with. It's typically the person in charge of the program that you're involved in. In small companies, it would be either the chief medical officer or the CEO, depending upon who's there. But you're the people who are doing the work, and you deserve to sort of have this go the way you expect it to. And that ends up being no different from any other sort of growing business or research relationship. It could be the same with one of your collaborators in a center grant. Third, this is like a plea from me to all of you. Commit to protecting confidential information. It's great to talk about how you're working with a company. You have to disclose that. It is absolutely a death sentence to talking about the things that you've heard or seen during an advisory board, or have access to through discussions with the scientists or investigators as part of a clinical trial. People, the SEC gets involved. This is the Security Exchange Commission. If you have, insights into evolving data, if you have access to protocols and you send them around to lots of interested investors or others, I mean, this is just not something to do if you really want to be involved in this kind of work. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times you'll have access to, just like you do if you're reviewing papers, access to a lot of confidential information. To companies, that confidential information is pretty much all they've got to really rest on as a company. Understand what's expected as an outcome. And is it a paper? Is it IP we talked about before? Is it preliminary data that you can use to to start a joint venture with the company. I mean, we've done some of these sorts of things. Anything is up for grabs, but make sure it's explicit. And if you have a plan in mind, it's probably best to talk about that up front, because you don't want to be surprised or being taken, and companies hate to be surprised or being taken by surprise. And this goes back to, know what you're signing up for, which is, don't be afraid to ask a lot of questions. You'll have peers, more senior peers within your department or across the institution. It's a great way to interact with them. Probably the people who are most senior have done investigator-sponsored or sponsored research agreements, and we'll have a lot of tips on how best to do this inside of your institution, which is going to be very different from place to place. Next one, and again, it's harder for you to control this, but it's important to keep in mind, how the research office negotiates on your behalf absolutely affects how you and your peers at your institution will be perceived by potential collaborators. And this is now advice from being on both sides of this. The best way to have them represent your interests is to tell them explicitly, not just to hand them a contract and let them go and do their thing. This is usually outside of everyone's comfort zone, because when you're dealing with the NIH or a foundation, it's usually pretty standard. We get the overhead, and these are the things that USC needs and so forth. But if there's something in particular, going back to point one, that's your goal for this interaction, be sure that the people that are representing you know that. I can't tell you the number of times that I've had our legal team interacting with the legal team at universities, and we've reached loggerheads because the investigator hasn't been involved to explicitly say what they were doing. And so the contracting people and the legal people do what they do, protecting the interests of the university at all cost. And it doesn't necessarily meet the priorities of the investigator. So staying close with them so they know exactly what you're looking for is, one, it's great to know the people and they will represent you well. And two, it can easily, really ease the way into getting some of this stuff done in a good way. Because what you're looking for ultimately is an authentic partnership, which is mutually beneficial. That's really the goal here. And when it works, it absolutely works like gangbusters. And when it doesn't, it just sort of fizzles and it feels kind of, like this is a waste of my time and energy. And that's never anyone's interest. And you could probably find examples within your colleagues of both those. And that's very much individually dependent, quite frankly. So here's the take-home points. You've probably heard them 2 or 3 times already. I haven't made this point already. This is a really important area. Real innovation happens at this juncture. We haven't talked about translational science, but everything I just said applies directly to translational science and new ideas. This is not the only way that innovation happens. It happens inside of companies, and breakthroughs happen there. Great ideas happen inside of universities, and people make companies and go off and do incredible things. Witness mRNA and vaccines and everything else. There's no simple place where innovation happens. A lot of it happens inside of places where I work as well. And just to keep that in mind, these collaborations really matter. It is an important source of funding. It's not the only source. It's not the biggest source, but it's a useful source, and it can do some really useful things, particularly early in career and even later on. Institutional processes matter. It was where I started, where I'll finish. But the investigator matters more. Two-way transparency, clear objectives, and being compliant and not being embarrassed about the compliance aspects of this. I'm certainly not. I put my company name on everything that I do. It's easy for me to write my disclosure statements because I'm fully employed. But the more informed you are about the process and what you're trying to do, the better it is. And the more you'll be able to mentor graduate students, fellows, residents. And I leave you with this image. It's just important to understand perspectives. You're sitting in, for me, this is what the world looks like. It's in Cora Bio, and the world is living in it. From USC or from Harvard or from Penn, we are the center of where it all happens, and everything else is some sort of undifferentiated mass. That's really not true. By the way, this is I have this poster. It's a Saul Steinberg New Yorker cover that hanging in my office as a reminder, because it's just important to keep in mind the many perspectives that people bring to this kind of work. So this one, I'm assuming that these slides will get shared. These are all really good resources. The one I would really submit everyone who's on this call, if they have any interest in this kind of work, should take a look at is the FDA draft guidance on investigator-sponsored trials. The Schachter paper in Nature Biotechnology, which is sort of the reverse view, is also important. There's also a biomedical one. The position paper, actually, it's a little bit dated, but it gives you a sense of the impact that these partnerships actually have, and the areas of growth. Neurology and neuroscience is a big area of growth in these kind of translational science and innovation, and you got to get a view of how the industry through bio, which is like pharma but for smaller companies, sort of views how best to implement these kind of interactions. And the first one is sort of literally a generic industry academic. So this is industry non-specific, but it's from Sloan, which is MIT School of Business, and it gives you a good sense of how companies that do this well really think about these interactions. I think that's pretty much all I had. Yeah, I have one example, but I'll reserve that in case we want to go down that road. So I'd ask if there's any questions. So Karen, thank you for your attendance. We will have a survey afterwards, but I'd really be happy to answer questions on any and all topics, including, my own personal journey, or what's worked, or what examples I've seen where it's absolutely flopped.
So I want people to chime in and join, but I'll kick it off with a hopefully a provocative question, right? So when you joined industry, what were some of the really hard moments when you learned there are skills needed here that I don't have? How am I going to do this?
Yeah, well, that happened day one. It is still happening now. Well, I would say my eyes were opened on day one on many of the things that I was sharing with you today, which is what is the infrastructure that's happening under the tip of the iceberg that you wouldn't necessarily see, which is all of the, Steve said the rigor that's related to industry-sponsored trials. I had never done one before. Everything from the oversight, the data management, all of the pieces that go into to the data collection, down to the statisticians reviewing things by statisticians. I mean, the level of oversight, rigor, and attention that's given to every aspect of this work. And by the way, that is not a complaint, appropriately so, is beyond what I had even remotely imagined. And it was exciting to see. It was startling to put that in perspective when you realize some of the things that have gone horribly wrong, and how could it possibly happen given all of the things that all of the checks and balances that are in place. But I felt like I had stepped through a door, quite frankly, into what is almost like a parallel universe, where we're using the same language and we're feeling like we're in the same, we're doing the same thing. I mean, ultimately developing and understanding new treatments for patients and how to move them forward, and how that all works and how to sort of sort through the machinery. That was really startling. I would say it took about 2 years in my case to really get a feel for how a physician operates in that environment. And even there, first I joined a very large company. AstraZeneca is a multinational company. At the time, it's smaller now, but at the time it was about 90,000 employees. To give you a sense of, I've never worked in such a, you realize you're this little, piece of it. And how do you even know how to get started in your day? And know what to do. Nobody gives you orders, just like, if you were a physician, you were the commander of your own ships and your teams and so forth. And now you're part of a machine that has a very specific task. How do you figure out how to do that? And a lot of it has to do with just being humble enough to ask a lot of questions, and then ultimately developing confidence on how to actually get that work done. And, it goes back to what Steve was saying, which is, for me personally, I felt like I had joined my squad. This is definitely where my niche was. Some people go and it's not for them. Many colleagues who have left academia, gone into industry, gone back into academia, have gone into private practice, back again. So the other myth is that it's a one-way trip. That is just absolutely, I can't stress that, it's absolutely not the case. It is absolutely not the case. The things that you learn in academia and clinical medicine apply every day. The things that if you were to choose this path and go back, the things that you've learned give you insights into areas of the work that we're all collectively doing that you would never have no other way of seeing. Now, some large companies do have secondments and internships for residents. I know that Biogen has one with MGH, and many other large companies will do this to allow, I think, residents primarily to do a half a year to dip their toe in. These are really great ways to sort of understand what it's like. And even if you have no interest at all in doing it for a career, understanding what it is it's really enlightening. It's really enlightening. The other transition, Steve, you didn't ask about this, but I had left Big Pharma where you do a little bit of this as a physician. It's to going to a startup company where I literally had to do everyone's job. And all the things that I didn't have access to and didn't have any visibility to, even at a large company, became my responsibility overnight. And that was equally eye-opening. I would just say that.
Thank you. So what other questions do folks have?
I have a question. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Pradeep.
No, go ahead.
I was going to ask if, have you ever thought of coming back to academics, and what would it take for you to come back? Do you miss it?
Oh, that's a great question. Do I ever? Okay, so the things that I would probably not want to do because I've been out of it for so long is go back to doing clinical medicine. And for a long time, when I went to AstraZeneca, I maintained my medical license both in Connecticut, actually, and in Pennsylvania, where I was practicing at the time. And they let you do that for a certain period of time. And I presumed, well, if I didn't like it, I'd go back. And there was certainly an open door, and I don't leave on good terms. People sort of wonder, what got into you. But other than that, it was sort of like, let's try this out. Then, at a certain point, 150 hours of CME plus all the other things that you need became really burdensome. Even though you can get them at conferences and so forth, it sort of became less and less relevant. So I went on retired status, means that in Pennsylvania, you don't have to carry malpractice insurance, and God help you, you're able to write prescriptions for your immediate family. And I did that for a while, and my family thought it was great. And I became increasingly concerned that my 1 year of internal medicine in 1995 probably is not the most up-to-date way to prescribe medicine for the people closest to me. So at a certain point, I sort of realized that clinical medicine and psychiatry, if I were ever to really rev that back up, would require a lot more effort because I'm not directly involved in it. That said, I do, I would consider appointments, particularly in translational medicine. Some universities have internal incubators that are involved in directly trying to translate and bring drugs forward, and so Duke has one, I think. UVA has incubators. So those kinds of things where there is an interest in sort of entrepreneurship, incubating small companies, mentorship into academics on how to get those kinds of things started, those would be of interest. People that are in roles like mine sometimes have cross appointments at institutions that allow for that. At this point in my career, I view my role as much more broad than simply running Ancora Bio, which is kind of trying to share these kinds of experiences as well. But to, and I'll give you a few other examples. So the person who started Sage, where my previous company, probably the most experience I've had, is a guy named Steve Paul. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, it's somebody you should probably know. He's sort of a giant in neurobiology, neuroscience. He started his career at NIMH. I think he trained, I believe, at Hopkins. In any case, he was at NIH for a very long time, neurobiologist, did clinical psychiatry. And then he left and probably made his largest mark as the head of R&D at Eli Lilly. And so under his direction, almost their entire pipeline of the well-known drugs, whether it be Prozac or Olanzapine and so forth, were all developed, as well as many other drugs. When he retired, he went into biotech and started first company before Voyager, his gene therapy company, another one called Karuna, which is a psychiatry, schizophrenia company, and also had academic appointments at Cornell, as well as at WashU. Now, he's an energetic guy. He's much older than me. He's also a member of the Institute of Medicine and so forth. So it is a bit of a semi-porous membrane. He's able to, because he has made a lot of money, he's able to finance his own research, and so he's very desirable at research institutions. But he's continuing to make a mark both on the academic and industry fronts. And in Europe, this is much more common. Quite frankly, many people have both cross appointments even as they move in to industry, and so I would say it's not as much of a dichotomy as it might appear when you've come through 20 years of training to do a very particular thing. For me personally, it's not part of my plan.
It's not what?
It's not, that would not be part of my plan. I mean, I would much rather do this, come and talk to you guys. And, I do this, at a number of institutions as well. And not, just as a way of sort of, giving people an understanding of what it means to both interact with industry, as well as consider careers, quite frankly. It is absolutely viable. And the other piece of it you should know is that there are a lot of people that come and work in industry that maintain their clinical practices. And typically that's 1 day a week. And usually in an academic center, depending on your field, there's enormous scarcity. My field is psychiatry, enormous scarcity in psychiatry. And so, often academic appointments and companies are very accommodating of those kinds of things. It's actually quite valuable if that's of interest. But not
Thank
for me
you.
personally.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Pradeep, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. I am fairly junior and sort of starting off my career, but I'm in a smaller division that has a lot of collaborations. And so I've been roped into a few sort of conversations from industry that are interested in doing primarily device trials in RED for like FDA approved or nearly approved sort of devices. And one of the things I am just learning about, and I have very little information, so this is actually very helpful, is sort of those like initial conversations. Just I don't know like how they're like. There's a little bit of a dance around like the concepts and ideas around the device, but then also like our ideas about future potential applications, which are actually things that they hadn't really thought of because that's why they're bringing it to us. And so how you sort of have those initial conversations while being respectful, but then also making a plan, like when do you involve the right people to sort of start to formalize the agreements and things, and like that whole initial piece of the conversation.
Yeah. So great question, because right to the heart of this discussion. So there's a lot of things there. I'll ask you a question. If you don't know the answer, this will be the place to start. Do you know where in the organization the people who are asking you these questions are coming from? Are they coming from medical affairs? Are they coming from R&D? Are they coming from the commercial organization? And I know that sort of seems fussy to you, but it matters. Do you know who's been sort of approaching you to talk about collaboration?
You mean from the industry side?
Yeah, from the industry side, exactly.
A lot of these are on the smaller side, so they're sort of startups, and so it ends up being sort of the the folks in charge of the device or who developed the device. So
Okay.
it tends to be the developers, if that is a fair answer.
Yeah, that's exactly the answer. So that would be, I mean, I would put that broadly into the R&D category. So that helps, because, what you'd want to have a discussion up front. And I think, Steve had mentioned this earlier. If you have ideas that you're injecting into those discussions, you'd probably want to, at minimum, keep really, really, really good notes. Because while you won't be able to sort of, claim, well, you might certainly will have potentially inventorship rights. That's number one. And the technology transfer office will explain to you exactly what benefits accrue to you. And typically there's sort of tiered benefits. When you sign on as a faculty member, you sort of sign over all your rights, but there's certainly some entrepreneurial, most typically at universities, some entrepreneurial benefit to you and or your research endeavor. So you don't want to lose those by these kind of relatively casual conversations. So if it's something that you're interested in doing, and it sounds like it is, it is absolutely not unexpected for you to say, hey, listen, I'm interested in doing this. I really need to understand, what the nature of these conversations are, because I want to make sure that we all understand where it is that these ideas are going. And from a company's perspective, I know it sounds odd and awkward personally. That's an expected question, right? That's a sophisticated question. That will not be misperceived. I'm really interested in working with you. I think this is a really innovative problem, sort of being you. I think there are some ideas that I might want to bring. I do want to talk to you about how or what kind of structure you'd imagine this work going under. And my guess is in devices, they kind of exist somewhere between a sponsored research agreement and an investigator-sponsored trial. If they're bringing ideas to you and you're sort of brainstorming, it's probably going to be under the sponsored research agreement kind of rubric. It's worth talking to them up front about what that means or what they're thinking. And they may not, if it's a really small company, they may be not thinking about it as strategically as we're talking about it here, but you'll catalyze the conversation. But it's better than spending 2 years talking to them and then a year later they've taken your idea. You're wondering what happened. You're not publishing. Nothing's really gone anywhere, and you're feeling like you've been sort of left at the side of the road. Which is, I can't imagine that's anyone's intent. But having those discussions up front, so it's like any other relationship, is really important before you get too far down the road. Because a good company will have that conversation to be really transparent. The company that's looking to take advantage will be like, whoa, it's way too soon to talk about that. Let's kind of see where this goes. And that should give you pause. That is like me to you. That's not like the company. But yeah, I mean, if you don't feel like your interests are being attended to, you have a huge institution that could stick up for you however you like. But it's much easier just to have the discussion.
But I would just add, things come to fruition a decade or more after that initial conversation.
Yep.
And in the US, like the rest of the world now, it is first to file patents, not first to invent. So you can have lab notes till the cows come home. Whoever files the patent has the patent. You can contest it if you've got good lab notes, but now you're trying to actually undermine their patent, you're not sort of like have a piece of the action.
Yeah. Yep.
So you're much, much better off to protect, then disclose if you can, than you are to disclose and then try to claw back your intellectual property. You can't. It'd be like trying to claw back a sneeze. You can't.
Yeah. And if it's a really good idea, you'll be up against a bigger machine than any institution will be interested in doing. Now, the big challenge, and again, I don't know if any of you had a chance to do this yet, tech transfer offices, depending upon the institution, may or may not actually want to file because there's some cost and effort involved and so forth. But as Steve said, it's absolutely in your interest. And again, protecting your interests, you're talking to people who are in business. They will absolutely understand the need to protect your interests. And if they don't, you should just, move on, quite frankly. Like that is the way that people in in industry talk to each other all the time. We're not sitting down unless we sort of understand what terms we're talking about. And it's not even, there's no offense taken about that. I mean, really. You will look unsophisticated if you don't even have that, and you can do it in a very polite way, but it's really important, really important. I love
Thank you.
discussions.
That was very helpful.
That means you're talking to somebody who's really interested in doing something meaningful. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was saying thank you. That was actually very good framework to work with. So thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if there are any like video vignettes of these types of situations that like all the students that are here that are in early career research paths could have access to. Do you know of any? Or
I don't know of any.
Should we create them?
The things to do, I mean, well, you'll have this, right?
We do have this.
Yes, you have this. And by the way, you'll also have my contact. I mean, everyone all over the place is sending me emails all the time. I mean, this is not confident. I mean, not sharing anything with you that's confidential in any way, shape, or form, which means there's no sensitivity to this. So if you guys have questions, I mean, hopefully you have my email. I do answer emails. So particularly for people who are interested in going down this road, I'm happy to be a resource. I'll share with you one anecdote, and which is kind of what this looks like when it works well. And I'll use a Sage example because it's just such an extraordinary example. When I first started there, we had no real clue about what we would do with our lead product, which is essentially allopregnanolone. It's a progesterone metabolite. And we were thinking we were going to do some version of epilepsy, severe forms of epilepsy. And there was also interest in whether or not brexanolone, was useful in postpartum depression based on basic science that had been going on for several decades. And we didn't have a lot of money, but we did have some interested academic collaborators. And the first thing that I did when I came is set up consulting agreements with folks in this case at UNC, and had them come and talk. Now, this is to Pradeep. We set up a consulting agreement first, which laid out the sort of the ground rules, and then we invited them to talk. And that only took like a week. It didn't take very long, but at least we understood like where the IP outcomes from those meetings would sit and how they would be handled if anything spectacular came with it. It ends up being really important. So these individuals came, we discussed some just very high level ideas about where we might want to go with the program, and agreed to do some exploratory work, in this case, in addition to what we were doing in postpartum depression. And we were either going to do it as an investigator-sponsored trial or as an industry-sponsored trial. And we decided to do it as an industry-sponsored trial because it was easier for us. And at the time, the investigator didn't have an infrastructure to actually account for a lot of the safety and other regulatory pieces that we needed to attend to. The drug was being developed for another indication. It was well into it was being actively prescribed to patients or administered to patients who were very severely ill. It was too risky for the company to let somebody who wasn't a pharma person handle it in the wild. And what happened was we did a single site trial. So you could do an industry sponsored trial at one site, and the preliminary results were extraordinary. And we immediately converted that to a multi-site phase 2 trial, brought in some academic sites and some professional research sites, expanded the trial, did more, but kept that initial group on as consultants. So that person who was a site level PI then became the overarching principal investigator for the entire program. Having started as a relatively, I would say minor, but sort of small participant in our initial investigative work. That worked as well. And the program continued to expand until a full phase 3 program was successfully prosecuted. So thankfully, and knock wood, it moved all very efficiently. Here I have I don't have a timeline. I just made these slides 2 days ago. But along the way, we had many, many discussions weekly we agreed that we wouldn't let bad blood come up between myself and the PI about anything, great or small. The contracting people aren't talking. How are we going to solve it? My clinical research associate is pissing off the nurses, and they're not going to give patient one a drug if they keep this up. You've got to have them back off. And we just committed to actually speaking every week, every Friday morning at 8:30 for half an hour to clear the air and talk about everything from the trials, the trial design, publications, the conduct, where are the checks and how come they're not coming? What is the FDA saying? Literally every aspect of the work until it was completed. And we had major papers in many, many journals, including Lancet and New England Journal. All of that agreed up front, so there weren't questions about it. And there was no way in which it was unclear who would be presenting at major conferences and who would be sort of directly involved in interpreting data. Now, nobody asked about interpreting data. We should get into that a little bit as well. But it was always clear up front, and whenever there was a question, and there were many, many questions, we had a way of resolving them, without it getting to a place where we were not able to do it amicably. To this day, this is now years ago, we still talk 8:30 every Friday morning now because we became close, and we sort of talk about the world at large and how to move the field forward. That is an example of how this works to everyone's mutual benefit. Academically, institutionally, the company ended up supporting the research center. By the way, the reason we went to UNC had to do with their capability. At the time, they were the only institution that had a dedicated inpatient peripartum treatment center in the United States of America. See, Steve Siegel. It was not a widely recognized capability, and so it was the only place we could actually really do the work. And that's extraordinary, but it has to do with capabilities, interest, and some of the things that we mentioned. Another example of one that's worked is, and by the way, the initial indication was an absolute disaster. It flopped like nobody's business. The drug did not separate from placebo, and we all shook hands and went away. But there's a coda to that particular story, even in failure. The principal investigator of that study, who is at a large New England institution, so-called Mecca, was also interested in machine learning, and so has taken all of the data from that trial through a sponsored research agreement and is testing out and working through potential machine learning algorithms to see if we can understand more about the structure of the underlying disease. And that agreement, and this is public, may potentially lead to a small business grant through the FDA. And so there are ways to take things that do and don't work, add value, come up with innovative ideas, and make use of the information. And the key is to just be clear about what it is that you're looking to accomplish. Nobody asked me the elephant in the room is what happens if the company doesn't agree with the principal investigator in terms of the conclusions from a clinical trial.
Is that possible?
It happens every day. It happens every day. The other place. So there's two things. There's two aspects of this. It's who gets to look at the raw data. What does it mean to have oversight of the principal investigator to sign off as an author, attesting to the statistics and the validity of the outcomes? And how do you, as an academic investigator, give yourself comfort that what was done is actually legitimate? I mean, these are all real concerns, by the way. I am not looking to diminish those concerns at all. Everybody has different risk tolerance. There's no simple answer because none of us, unless maybe some of you have degrees in statistics and know how to work with SAS data sets and so forth.
They're learning.
Good. God bless you. That is not my, it's like, for me, it's like sand through a sieve. I get it during the moment they're explaining to me. But typically what happens is that we have statisticians, then we have external statisticians that check the statisticians. I mean, I was joking about this, but that's actually how it works. So the principal investigators who are interested, and certainly the FDA, have to sign off on the statistical analysis plan, which is a separate document from the protocol. The statistics are actually done outside of a company by a separate group. And sometimes there's a DSMB, sometimes there's not. And then those data are confirmed by our internal statisticians and data managers. We have to attest to the fact that all the data sources were verified. If you're an investigator-sponsored trial, you have to attest to it. And then we have an open book session where people can ask the questions that they need to either the statisticians, or if they really are that committed, coming in and looking at the tables and listing figures and do spot checks on the source. I've yet to see an investigator actually come and do spot checks on the source, although people are entitled to do it. A lot of that has to do with proximity and practicality. The most extreme version of this I've seen is one principal investigator who insisted on hiring, in this case it was a he, so his own independent statistician, and then we had to negotiate with him to transfer our raw data SAS data sets to have them independently program and run our statistics using an entire, now fourth party statistician to confirm, so that he would be an author, a lead author on a paper. That's an extreme. I've never seen anyone do that before or since. But I think a lot has to do with, the fact that people are being asked to attest to the fact that they're signing off, if you're an author on a major paper, to the accuracy and veracity, both of the data, the execution, and the outcome. So, it's a bit of a gut check. I would say the best thing to do would be to sort of be keeping track along the way. And then if you have the heebie-jeebies, to really dig in and see how the company responds. But more typically, people are, if you guys are investigators, you have a statistician. If you want them to look at the statistical analysis plan and make sure it's bona fide, that usually suffices. And we typically have a session whereby all investigators who are involved are able to ask questions and answer them. The other place where this comes up is whether or not the safety data are really being accurately interpreted. If you're an investigator in a multi-site trial, I encourage you to ask questions about the safety data and how they're reported to the FDA. Any company that's worth their salt to be very clear about that, and which things were adverse events and serious adverse events, how they're coded and so forth. Anyone who doesn't answer questions straightforward, it should give you questions about the entire endeavor. That is literally Steve to you all. It shouldn't be a mystery. And, we're presuming to make drugs that are going to go to millions and millions of people around the world. If there's something fishy, people will be very clearly not being forthcoming about that.
Can you talk about, I know we're sort of running up against the end, but, you had talked about de-risking things, or you sort of alluded to this before.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I encountered as I did work with industry throughout my career was this construct that once you have a study defined or data lock or anything like that, it's really important that the investigators not do additional things, not ask additional questions, not, anything you do can impact the future of that asset. So you don't do a study without their approval. You don't ask a question without their approval. You don't, follow on in ways that could impact the development path. It kind of comes with the turf. Can you touch on that in any way?
Yes. So it goes back to Cecilia, your question before, which is ownership of the data and who gets say. So conceptually speaking, what Steve has said is exactly the way in which sponsored research not sponsored research is industry-sponsored trials go, right? You ask a very specific question, you engage a number of what we call sites, you'll call, universities as well as professional sites that are all involved in that research. And the absolute rigor of this is to do it to the letter, to not ask additional questions, not because they're not important, but because anything that comes up strange or out of the ordinary, particularly with a limited data set that you have access to, can really skew the interpretation and be a rabbit hole down which you can never really emerge. So I'll give you some examples. So for example, you as an investigator are not initially going to know which of your patients were randomized to drug or not. And you won't be able to tell whether or not there is a disparity in adverse events. And a lot of times the sensitivity is around safety signals. And the only way to really understand safety signals is to look at them in aggregate of the drug, including all of the trials that have been run, not even one individual smaller trial. And so the only way to really be able to do that is to look at the thousands of patients that have been treated across all of the trials to really be able to get a sense of those things. And so the expectation is that there isn't any additional add-on analysis. Now, two things to that. So there are ways in which to get at those data. So after the completed, and this has to do with data transparency. After the protocols are completed, the databases are locked, the primary trial is done, and the conclusions are drawn. The data that you've collected, depending upon how your institution has negotiated, is either certainly free for you to publish based on post hoc analyses. And of course, those will be limited by the fact that you are an individual site, and that'll be disclosed in the trial. Those are considered not really of a risk because the real statistics are related to the overall large trial. And so anything other than that is going to be caveated around, the specifics around your institution and how many people you've enrolled in a study. Likewise, if there's an interest initially in having an add-on study to the study that's already ongoing. So for example, if you're interested, and I'll just use examples that I'm much more familiar with, if you're interested in brain imaging and you wanted to know whether or not the patients that were involved in this trial, ultimately when you know who was or wasn't on drug, responded in particular ways based on the technique that you're interested in, EEG or brain imaging. Those are things that you could certainly approach as an investigator-initiated trial. Or if you have funding, you certainly, again, it depends upon the nature of the contract, would be able to do based on your ownership of the data. So a lot comes down to your expectations and the ways in which those clinical trial agreements were discussed and agreed ahead of time. If it's not there, you do put yourself way out there. And depending upon the company, like a large company like a J&J or Pfizer, we can't speak for them, but they typically don't allow for that level of exploratory work. Smaller companies who are looking to leverage expertise, capability, interest, and know-how are usually a little bit more amenable to doing exploratory work, but not for something that is about to be filed, registered, and so forth. So you can imagine the situation from the company's perspective. It's the first drug. I'll use Zulresso as an example. The company's ever done. This is existential for the company. It's a newly public company, so there are shareholders and everyone cares about what happens. And somebody at Podunk State says, well, in our patients, all the ones that were on drug had grew an extra eyeball, but nobody on placebo did. The entire thing goes pear-shaped. The entire thing goes pear-shaped for something that's not accurate based on the totality of data. And so those are the kind of things that Steve was talking about. Those represent unacceptable risks. And a lot of it depends upon the stage of development, the size of the company, and perhaps most importantly, the nature of the agreements that you have beforehand. And if this is an area of interest, if you're interested in having this as part of your portfolio of research activities, you wouldn't do it. You'd engage around your interest in potentially doing these things and agree them either up front or afterwards. Even afterwards is okay too. But I wouldn't to do it sort of willy-nilly it's kind of out of bounds. And it really represents a risk. It's unfair. It's unfair. No, think about it. It's unfair to patients. So say there's a great drug, it's about to be launched, and you do this and you find something out and you feel like you can't hold back because you believe you understand something. You feel obliged to share that. It could prevent something from moving forward that would otherwise be really beneficial. And so those kinds of things end up being very delicate operations. I know it sounds overly protective in the company guy, but you got to look at the overall, like, what is the dossier that really the FDA and the advisory committees review? It's everything. It's not any individual study, positive or negative. It's the same reason why for sponsored research agreements for a drug that's actively under development, it would unlikely be shared with basic scientists, even though it's a good idea. And mainly the reason is, and with all due respect to you guys, you would never do this, but typically if it's an animal study, you'd have a graduate student or an undergraduate, God help you, doing these animal studies. And even if they're well trained, a rat could die. A couple of rats could die. Rats could die quickly. They could develop a seizure because they've gotten injected incorrectly, or they can hemorrhage and so forth. Those end up being part of the overall non-clinical safety profile of the drug. That's not okay. So all of our safety studies are done in what's called good laboratory practice under exquisite supervision, so that the official sort of word on this is very tightly prescribed. And so companies will be very, very reluctant to do it, not because, it could easily sound like, we don't want anybody to touch our toys, or we're afraid of what you might find. But it's really about, doing things under highly, highly controlled or controllable things. And, stuff happens anyway, but at least we're doing it, with our full understanding of what those risks are.
Thank you. I thought that last example really summed up what I was talking about. Was
Yeah.
A lot of everything you do has potential for benefit and risk.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to be foreign to a lot of academics to think that you have to be really, really mindful about the questions you ask, because there's always this risk that you may not want to incur late in a development stage.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, the thing I would caution you, and so here I am talking to you relatively frankly, that could easily sound as though I've said there are questions we don't want to know the answer to. That is absolutely not the case. But there are technical risks that are inherent in the work that we all do collectively that would not be acceptable depending on the stage of development. And that's really what we're talking about here.
Thank you.
Yep.
So I think we are very close, if not at the end. It's 4:51.
My word.
Are there any other burning questions, or are we sort of at our end? Cecilia, did you want to make any closing comments before we thank Steve for his time today?
I just want to say, so Steve, Stephen Canis.
Cadence, yep.
Kings. I work with Stephen. We co-lead a training program. So what we've talked about today is like things that I think about all the time. And I just have like 15 ideas of how we could incorporate these kinds of conversations in a training program, and how beneficial, even if no one's ever going to go into industry, how to understand industry and how that would affect maybe even how they do the research at academic settings. So I just want to thank you for inspiring us and for being candid and for just sharing all your experience. You just laid it out there for us. So I really want to thank you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. One of my longer term missions, and I said, I'm trying to transcend simply being at Ancora or Sage or any place else, is to break down this barrier. When I left Penn to go into industry, it was probably at the nadir of the reputation of the pharmaceutical industry, absolutely, through the floor. It pains me because there was a time, and this was I'm in my 50s. There was a time when the pharmaceutical companies were literally the most admired companies in the world, not just in the United States, for the incredible things that they do. And of course, we've had experiences of what that looks like in real life this last year. And so it's not without its risks. It's not without, a history of abuses, an issue of compliance and so forth. But it is really exciting. And, I've always said that if the things that I've done already are all that I've ever done, one drug, almost 20 years, that's plenty. And many people in this industry don't even have that. And so, it really is a pleasure to talk to you all. And again, I do not say this lightly. If you have any questions at all, I think, Karen, you have my email. Just send me a note. Happy to answer.
You have many thank yous in the chat from the audience.
Very good. Well, have a great afternoon all.